Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. In this episode, we get to speak to retired Executive Assistant Director Shawn Henry. Now, Shawn served in the FBI for 24 years. When he left the Bureau in 2012, he was overseeing all criminal and cyber investigations worldwide. During his career, Shawn held multiple positions relating to cybercrime and computer intrusions, including Deputy Assistant Director and Assistant Director of the Cyber Division at FBI headquarters, Supervisor of the FBI Cybercrime Squad in Baltimore, and Chief of the Computer Investigative Unit within the FBI-led National Infrastructure Protection Center. Shawn managed computer crime investigations spanning the globe, including denial of services attacks, bank and corporate breaches, and state-sponsored computer intrusions. Currently, Shawn is the president of CrowdStrike Services and leads a team of cybersecurity professionals who investigate and mitigate targeted attacks on computer networks. So basically what I'm saying is Shawn knows cybercrime, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to interview him on the show. Shawn is what we call in the FBI an HBO, a High Bureau official. Now, I'm looking at Shawn's bio right now, and it says here that he has been featured on every major media network, including 60 Minutes, CBS Evening News, CNN, Dateline, Fox News, Good Morning America, The Today Show. He's also been featured on radio and other publications by Businessweek, Forbes Magazine, New York Times, Reuters, US Today, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. And so all I have to say is, Shawn, you're going to need to update your bio and make sure you add FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. The only thing about the episode that I do want to tell you is that I wish the sound quality, the audio quality, was a little bit better. We did do this interview over the phone and unfortunately not by Skype, but I can tell you that the content, in spite of the audio quality, is excellent. Now, before we get to that interview, I just have a few things to say. Of course, I got to plug my book and just remind you that I am a crime fiction writer and that my novel, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, will be released on September 20th. I also want to say that it has been 6 months since my podcast was chosen to be on the front page of iTunes' new and noteworthy section, and I believe that the success of this podcast is due to that. You know, to get an email from a stranger saying, hey, your podcast is number one on new and noteworthy, and I didn't even know what new and noteworthy meant at the time, was spectacular. So I am writing a blog post, which I will put out next week, about 5 lessons that I've learned since being featured number one on iTunes New and Noteworthy. So look out for that. And the people on my who subscribe to my email list, I'll just send you a link to that so you won't miss it. I do want to give a shout out to someone who left me the most spectacular review on iTunes. And I am talking to you, Dr. Gordo. Now, Dr. Gordo left me a 5-star review, and he says, this podcast is gold for writers or anyone interested in stories and the perspective of retired FBI agents who dealt with some of the most dramatic cases imaginable. Guests have a wide range of career highlights to discuss, so it never feels like more of the same. Many episodes debunk the perceived persona of typical TV FBI agents, and the cases vary greatly, often layered with that could only happen in a movie moments. I've listened to every episode, and I always look forward to new ones. The host, Jerry Williams, is a crime writer, so she typically offers reading suggestions and authenticity clarifications for readers and writers. Highly recommend. Wow, Dr. Gordo. Thank you. All right, well, that's it for me for now. Let's get on with the show. Remember to stick around at the end for my recommendation. This week, it's a more than appropriate crime drama pick. Now, here's the show. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome my guest today, Shawn Henry. Hi, Shawn.
Hi, Jerry. How are you?
I am thrilled to death. I mean, I am on the phone getting ready to interview the retired FBI Executive Assistant Director. That's big time for me. Thank you.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've done so many fascinating things in your career. I want to concentrate this interview on cybercrime. But before we get into that, so you can give us an explanation, a definition of what cybercrime is, I want to learn, a little bit about you, who you are, why you joined the FBI, when you joined the FBI.
Okay. Well, it's a very interesting story, actually. I was always interested in law enforcement. My father was a New York City detective for 33 years, and I always had that interest. And I had never considered the FBI. I always thought I'd be a police officer somewhere. When I was a senior in high school, I had a family friend who actually graduated from the FBI Academy. So as an 18-year-old with big eyes, I walked down into the Jefferson dorm, into this big open atrium area, and I looked around and I said to myself, I am coming here. As an 18-year-old. And honest to goodness, everything I did from that day on was geared towards me going into the Bureau, including studying, if you can believe it or not, accounting at the time, which was one of the big areas that would help you get in, because the Bureau was interested in accountants and lawyers and the like. Fast forward another 7 years or 8 years later, and I came in January of 1989 as a special agent of the FBI.
And what offices were you assigned to? If you can just kind of give us a brief rundown, and also the positions that you held in those offices.
I had 13 different jobs in my career. I spent 24 years in the Bureau. I actually, after 2 years of college, as a 20-year-old, I started as a GS3 file clerk in the New York field office, literally pushing a mail cart. I was going to school at night, all toward my goal of becoming a special agent. I did that for about a year and a half and realized that going to school at night and working all day, commuting back and forth, it was just going to be too challenging. So I resigned from the Bureau in 1984 and went back to finish my school full-time. Came in January of 89 as an agent. And my first office of assignment was the Washington field office, which was incredible experience. I worked primarily public corruption, but a lot of other investigations. I was part of the SWAT team, and I just had a great time there. I went to FBI headquarters in 1996 as a supervisor in the public corruption unit, overseeing corruption matters across the country. And then I went to the computer intrusion unit in 1999. It was my first foray into cybercrime, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. In that position, I ran computer intrusion matters around the country. I was subsequently a supervisor in the Baltimore office. I was an ASAC in the Philadelphia office. I was on the inspection staff. I went and became the deputy assistant director of the cyber division. I was the assistant director of the cyber division. I was the assistant director in charge of the Washington field office, the first office I started in as a new agent. And 20 years later, I was leading that office, which was really something I was very, very proud of. And then I came back ultimately as the executive assistant director, overseeing the criminal and cyber and international operations for the Bureau. And from there, I retired in 2012.
Well, let me ask you, when you joined the FBI, did you know that you wanted to go into management? Was that a goal for you?
Absolutely not. I wanted to be an FBI agent. I think being on the SWAT team was a goal of mine. That was one thing I was really interested in doing, and participating in investigations was really the dream I had. I never suspected that I would continue to grow in the organization, but like anything else, I think as you participate and mature and learn, your goals start to change as you move through your career, and that happened for me. But I never really looked more than a couple of years ahead. I've always guided people and mentored people that you want to always think a couple of years ahead. What are the types of things you'd like to be doing? Where do you ultimately want to be? But I hadn't thought ahead 15 years or 20 years. Those were somewhat surprises as I traversed through my career, but it was a very exciting experience for me.
Well, as the executive assistant director, you're right underneath the director. I take it you were one of his direct reports.
Well, we had the deputy director in between, but it really was a leadership team. Under Director Mueller, there was a group of about 5 or 6 people who really were part of that inner circle. We would confer on a regular basis. There was a broader circle as well, the assistant directors and up. But there was really a group, the operational executive assistant directors, who really had under their purview the investigations, national security investigations, criminal investigations that were being handled globally. So that leadership team really conferred on a lot of the decisions on operations, tactical decisions, and the like. For about 2 years or so, I was engaged in that sphere, and it was really quite eye-opening, not only to see what was happening within the Bureau, but also externally in other government organizations, because as you know, the FBI has to coordinate and collaborate with the intelligence community, as well as other parts of the executive branch. There's a lot of interaction with Congress. So to really see the inner workings of Washington, D.C., and that broader, the word I use is sphere of influence, the way that decisions are made, the deliberations that go into that, and ultimately the decisions that were beneficial to help protect the American people.
Great. Well, I had a special request from one of my listeners, and this podcast has done very well. I've got listeners from around the world, but this particular listener, Ben Floyd, is in IT security, and he's an InfraGard member, and he asked me to see if I can get somebody on to talk about cybercrime. And so, Ben, I more than came through for you. So let's talk a little bit about cybercrime. Tell us, give us a broad overview of what cybercrime is in general.
So it's very important, I think, to really differentiate when you talk about cybercrime. It's such a broad area, and there's this school of thought now that any type of crime, even traditional crimes that are exploited in the physical world, that if they use a computer, they're a cybercrime. And I don't subscribe to that. I think that the use of computers to facilitate crime is a very important mechanism and component for the Bureau and other law enforcement agencies to focus on. But when I think of the cyber threat, what I focus on and where I focus the majority of my time in the Bureau and what I'm doing now in my current position is focusing on threats to the critical infrastructure, where nation states, foreign governments, terrorist organizations, criminals are able to breach networks, access computer networks where sensitive data is maintained. That data might be research and development. It might be corporate strategies. It may be intellectual property, or it may be personally identifiable information like credit card numbers and social security numbers, etc. These different groups are targeting that data because that data is incredibly valuable. Foreign intelligence services, for example, will access the data and provide it to corporations in their home country, thereby helping their companies compete on the global stage against U.S. companies, which is often undermining and certainly not fair trade. There are cyber criminals, typically out of Eastern Europe, who steal personally identifiable information for financial gain. We've seen cases as recently as just the last couple of months where we saw a bank in Bangladesh lose $81 million in one attack, where they were able to get in, breach the network, gain access to the network, and by using malicious code, they were able to manipulate the system and have financial transfers equating to $81 million. So it's just this huge risk that we face. There are terrorist groups that are targeting our critical infrastructure. I'm talking about power and light, water, communications, and transportation. They're looking to have an impact on this country the same way they did, and it's not just the U.S., it really is a global threat, targeting the critical infrastructure to impact them the way they do through kinetic attacks, to scare people, to intimidate people, to put fear in their hearts, and that is an active, ongoing program by these terrorist organizations. So you think
have we seen that actually, where somebody, a foreign government has come in and done a computer intrusion attack on infrastructure here in the U.S.?
There have been attacks on corporations, destructive attacks. We've seen the attack on the Sands Casino, which has been attributed by the U.S. government to Iran, and where computer systems were actually destroyed. Not just data that was taken, but actually inputting code into the computers that caused them to overwrite the boot sector, which essentially rendered them inoperable. We've seen the attack on Sony Pictures, where the North Korean government, again, it's attributed by the United States government, North Korean government came in and destroyed the network. And we've seen attacks on a dam in New York, which has been attributed loosely, not officially, to Iran. We've seen attacks on other pieces of critical infrastructure externally, in the Ukraine, for example, on the electric system there, that's been attributed by some in the media to the Russian government. So it's just a wide-ranging risk. The infrastructure is vulnerable, it's fragile, and there absolutely are actors who are looking to target it, to disrupt it, to have some impact on civilized world.
And so what do we do about it? I mean, is there a preventative method that the FBI can use or warn people about?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's multi-pronged. It starts with the private sector better protecting itself, and that means not only ensuring that they have reviewed and eliminated to the greater extent possible the vulnerabilities in their network. That includes patching their systems to ensure that exploits are removed. But they also need to look for anomalous behavior in their network. So while these networks that I'm talking about, that corporations have and infrastructure has, they're so vast, they're very, very difficult to protect with 100% certainty, to make sure that all the vulnerabilities are.
Can you give us some examples of vulnerabilities that they should be looking for, this behavior that they should be assessing?
Yeah, when you're talking about vulnerabilities that they need to remove, there are applications that are resident on most computers, and there's code in the operating system that is constantly being evaluated by those who support and develop those applications in those operating systems. Periodically, they find bugs that can be exploited, and they put out notifications. They push updates. You see this on your phone or your laptop. You get an update from your operating system, from your provider, saying, your system needs to be updated. There's a critical fix. You've got to do that because the adversaries know when these vulnerabilities are resident, and the adversaries will look to exploit it. They also know that many people don't ever update, so they're constantly searching for vulnerabilities that they can exploit to access a particular network. When you talk about what I say is hunting, so moving from the pure prevention side to being more proactive, organizations, companies need to actually look in their environment for anomalous behavior. And so what is that anomalous behavior? IT specialists understand that there are certain tools or tactics that adversaries will use. And by monitoring actively their log system, by monitoring changes in processes within their network, within their environment, looking for unusual types of behavior. A particular computer on the network, for example, that starts contacting an IP address that the network has never seen them contact before, and that they're downloading data or they're actually sending data. This type of proactive hunting or proactive analysis is something that has to be done with tools. It has to be automated. But if you've got people in the environment, IT security specialists, who understand the way the networks work, they understand what their typical network looks like, then when they see the outliers, when they see things that are occurring outside the normal parameters, that should raise a red flag and require additional investigation and analysis.
So maybe somebody who normally works during the day accessing their computer in the middle of the night.
That's a great example. It's a great example. I actually use an example very similar to that, where you've got a particular computer and this person typically works 9 to 5, and all of a sudden you see at 2 o'clock in the morning that person's computer is fired up, connected to the network, and actually connected to an external IP address. Now, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything bad is happening. Maybe the person's getting ready to go on vacation and they have some last-minute work to do, or they're under a deadline for an important project. But what it does require is somebody taking a look. When you can look at aggregate data, many of these networks have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of users or endpoints. Some of the big corporations we have might have 250,000 computers in their environment, desktops, laptops, servers. So in order to do that type of analysis that we just discussed, it's got to be done using automated tools that will help to find what I call a needle in a stack of needles. Find that one needle that's a little bent, that's a little rusty, really difficult to see, but if you use good technology, it can help identify for the humans the area that they need to focus on.
Now, can you talk to us about, and you did briefly mention a few, but can you talk about a case that the FBI investigated, a case of computer intrusion? I was reading up, getting ready for this interview, and I learned about this ransom thing.
Right.
I found that fascinating. Do you have a case that would tell us a little bit more about this type of threat?
Yeah, sure.
Or if you have one, anyone that you'd like to kind of take us through.
Well, I think about when I first started in cybercrime, computer intrusions, going back to late 1999, 2000. If you'll remember Y2K, I remember being in the computer intrusion unit at that time. And then what I see is the maturation of the problem and the evolution of the problem. Where we were there and where we are now are two entirely different places. So when I first started, there were these denial of service attacks where essentially an adversary could harness the power of tens of thousands of computers or even hundreds of thousands of computers by planting malicious software into them and then controlling them with one computer. So you can actually literally have one person who can control 10 commands to 10,000 computers and have those 10,000 computers all simultaneously contact your computer, which would essentially render it inoperable. It would knock it offline. The digital equivalent of, 10 people or 100 people simultaneously calling one particular phone number, and all of them except one would get a busy signal. And that would go on all day and all night if people were constantly doing it. So these denial of service attacks that knocked offline dozens of companies. This was in the early days of the internet, and you had Amazon and a lot of these online corporations that were selling to the general public. Yahoo may have been one actually back at that time. It was kind of the advent of adversaries in the public eye actually having an impact on ordinary day-to-day companies.
And who was doing this? Are these foreign entities, or are these just kids and hackers like Mr. Robot?
And in this particular case, this was actually a kid called Mafia Boy, his online handle. He was a 15-year-old kid out of Canada who was engaged in a lot of these types of attacks. And he was ultimately caught by the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, working in coordination with the FBI after he was identified. But that was really kind of the baseline. From there, what evolved in the criminal world were organized crime groups that were collaborating to target the financial services sector. And through the early 2000s and even towards the late 2000s, these organized crime groups stole tens of millions and now hundreds of millions of dollars from banks just by accessing the code and being able to reroute automated clearinghouse transfers to send wire transfers forth that were not authorized, moving them from account to account. What we see now with ransomware, to a much lesser extent, because you're not going to steal $81 million in one fell swoop through ransomware, but what ransomware does is rather than going in and stealing the personally identifiable information like credit cards, or going in and routing an automated clearinghouse transfer, an electronic funds transfer, what the criminals are doing is they are deploying malicious software onto corporate computers and even individuals' computers. And those computers are encrypted. All of the files on the computer are encrypted using very sophisticated algorithms that are impossible to decrypt without the key. What the criminals will do is then contact the companies or the individuals and tell them that oftentimes they portray themselves as a good hacker, and I've noticed that your computer system is not operating properly, and I can assist you if you'll pay my fee. And it's oftentimes thousands of dollars. In some cases, it's tens of thousands of dollars. In other cases, it's been hundreds of dollars. So it's really a kind of wide-ranging, depending on who's doing it and what system they've encrypted. And then when the user pays essentially the extortion or the ransom, which is the term ransomware, the hacker provides them the key, which they input, and it unlocks their computer. Interesting. It's really, if you think about the physical world and the migration of the physical world, the merging into this digital world, these are things that we've seen in the physical world with our time in the FBI, Jerry, for dozens of years, where people have been taken hostage and they've extorted a ransom out of the victims' families.
We've done a number of interviews. I did one with John Cosenza, who I know you know, and Sam Snemo, who both worked extraterritorial cases, and they talked about workers, American workers overseas being kidnapped for ransom. So this is really, like you said, the computer, the digital version of that same type of behavior.
That's exactly right. And the one difference is in the physical world, it doesn't scale very well. If you've got one or two people who are kidnapping a person, well, you can do that. You can kidnap the person, and then you've got to sit with them for a week while you negotiate this ransom, and you've got to monitor them and essentially guard them so they don't run away. That doesn't scale very well. But when you think about computers, one hacker can send out malware that encrypts the computers of hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously, and then sends this ransom request to hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously. And that scales very well for a digital criminal who wants to make a lot of money, because when you're getting paid by thousands of victims' families or victim corporations in this case you're going to get a much larger return than if you go out and kidnap one person from a company.
And what's the FBI stance on that? I would imagine that they don't want corporations to pay ransoms.
The FBI has come out publicly and said that organizations should not pay ransom. What the FBI has recommended, and I think it's rightfully so, that companies take preventive measures. Two things that they can do. First of all, most importantly, I think, is you have a backup of your entire system. And you should have that anyway, regardless of ransomware, because if your computer is lost due to a flood or a fire, if you can't access your building because of some type of a natural disaster or the like, you need to have your system backed up somewhere, and there are protocols to do that. We call it continuity of operations, or COOP. You've got to have a place to reconstitute your company's data and your company's network, and you've got to have backups in order to do that. So that's just standard protocol, and it's not just for ransomware, but it's for any type of situation that would render your data inaccessible. But again, going back to patching and keeping the ransomware off of your network in the first place and monitoring your system for this anomalous behavior. If you don't have your system patched, if you're not monitoring, you don't have your firewalls up to date, then you're going to be susceptible to this type of stuff.
Could you talk a little bit about how the FBI reaches out to these critical infrastructure organizations, municipalities and colleges and schools, and works with them in order to show them these preventative measures?
The FBI has a number of different outreach programs to the private sector. I think it's really important for people to understand that the government's role in protecting critical infrastructure is somewhat limited. The government is not monitoring all of the attacks that are coming in to corporations. In other words, the government is not sitting in the ISPs filtering out malicious traffic. That's not happening. And understandably, I think people can recognize that you wouldn't want the government monitoring all communications coming in across the wire. What the government's role is in helping to identify who the adversaries are and then taking some actions to mitigate the threat from those adversaries. So in the criminal case, it would be going out, effecting search warrants and collecting evidence, and then having somebody indicted and charged and convicted, arrested, and taken off the field, if you will, so they can't go out and continue to attack. That has limited success. While the Bureau has had good pockets of success, it's very, very difficult to identify who these people are, where they are. Oftentimes you're operating in foreign countries, and it's hard to, while we do have great coordination with foreign nations globally, there are certain countries that it's challenging to get people out of. What the Bureau has done to enhance their ability, though, is by sharing information with the private sector so they can better protect themselves. And through programs like InfraGard, which is a collaborative program where the Bureau shares intelligence, they share emerging threats, new techniques that adversaries are using, and conversely, the private sector through InfraGard will oftentimes share information of value with the FBI so that they can analyze it or they can share it more broadly with the larger InfraGard population. So that's one of the really good programs. That program's been in place since 1998, and there are tens of thousands of members around the country. The information sharing piece is so important because the majority of the networks reside in the private sector hands, and much of the threat is seen by the government in advance, and you've got to bridge that gap between the private sector companies that are susceptible to being exploited and the U.S. government, which has collected this valuable information that would help these companies better protect themselves. So that information sharing piece is critically important. InfraGard is a good, important step in that direction.
Excellent. So, when did you retire?
2012. 4 years ago, over 4 years ago.
And what are you doing now?
I am the president of CrowdStrike Services, the chief security officer of a company called CrowdStrike. We are protecting companies that are being attacked this way, companies that are trying to protect their digital data, their intellectual property, their sensitive corporate products and technology that are being targeted by these groups and nation states. So we've been doing that for about 4.5 years. We've developed technology that helps companies detect attacks before they rise to the level of destruction or rise to the level where an adversary can actually take the data off their network. Recognizing, again, that you just cannot prevent every single incursion into the network. The networks are too big, they're too vast, technology is too fragile. You're not going to stop everybody. Even though you've got your preventive measures in place and you've got all your patching done, etc., a determined adversary with enough time and enough effort, resources are going to get onto the network. So the key is being able to detect them, and if you detect them early enough, you can mitigate the attack.
Oh. So if I compared CrowdStrike with these corporations to, say, McAfee or Norton that the average person has on their computer, is that a good comparison?
There are similarities. What you're referring to when you talk about McAfee or Norton, you're talking about antivirus. And what antivirus does is malware has what we call signatures in it. Essentially, they're digital algorithms that allow you to identify a piece of software as good or bad. It's similar to DNA, really, and with existing capabilities, we're able to relatively quickly identify DNA. Same thing now with these networks. With antivirus, you've got these digital algorithms, and you're able to identify good software from bad software much of the time, but not most of the time. The adversaries have become so sophisticated that they are able to change the malware just a little bit. It doesn't change the functionality, but what it does change is that digital signature, and the algorithm changes just a little bit, and the antivirus doesn't pick it up. So antivirus in and of itself is not working very well. Also, what we've seen adversaries do is use tools that are resident on your operating system. And by manipulating those resident tools, it does not require them to download malware. So if you've got antivirus and you're relying on the antivirus to identify new malware coming into your organization, well, the adversaries aren't always using malware. They're able to access it another way, and you're not going to alert on that. And the adversaries are oftentimes in the environment for months or even years completely undetected. So the difference between a company like CrowdStrike and Norton or McAfee is that we have tools that detect not the malware or the signature, but we actually look at the processes that are occurring in the system. And we can identify multiple activities that should not be happening. And by identifying those anomalous behaviors, we are able to alert organizations that they've got a computer that is likely been taken over by a hacker or a malicious adversary.
All right, so we're just about out of time, but I do want to end on a positive note, because I'm telling you, I'm scared to death. You know, I'll check my bank account right after this to make sure that no one's come in and taken out the millions of dollars that I have in my savings. But so what do you think about the whole state of computer safety? I mean, is it going to get worse? Should we be scared? What should the person that's listening to this podcast, what should they be doing? What should they be thinking of?
I think it all starts with awareness and being sensitive to what the risks are. There are certain things that, honestly, are probably not of much concern. And if you recognize the risk in the network, the fragility of the network, then you should you should adjust your security based on that. So in other words, if you've got a significant bank account, maybe you spread it out among multiple banks to limit your risk posture, so that if one account is hacked, you don't keep all your eggs in one basket, if you will. Individuals need to be monitoring their networks on a regular basis. You need to have dual-factor authentication set up. This is one of the most important things that individuals can do. Dual-factor or multi-factor authentication is exactly how it sounds. When you have a username and password, that's one-factor authentication. If you use multiple factors, like a fingerprint, for example, along with your password, or a key fob along with your password, that is multi-factor authentication, and it's much harder, though not impossible, for an adversary to breach. A lot of banks are now using that. You'll go to log into your account with a username and password, and the bank will send a digital code to your cell phone, and then you'll enter that digital code into the account before you'll gain access. That's multi-factor authentication. The three factors of authentication are something you know, like your username and password, something you have, like a key fob or your cell phone, or something you are, which is biometric, your fingerprint, for example. So using multi-factor authentication is one of the better ways for people to protect themselves. And you can do that on your social media account. You've seen people whose Twitter accounts have been hacked because someone intercepted their password or they left it somewhere. But if you have multi-factor authentication, where in order to sign into your Twitter account and then they send a code to your cell phone, it's a higher degree of scrutiny. So lots of risk, lots of things to be concerned about. I think that there's a lot more for the government to do in coordination with the private sector, but individuals need to be aware, they need to be alert, and they need to ensure that they're constantly assessing the data, the resources, and the valuables that are contained on their networks.
All right, so here's my last question. Could you sum up your career, as far as cybercrime is concerned, and just your feelings about having been an FBI agent? How long were you in the FBI?
I was in the Bureau for 24 years, and it was absolutely an incredible experience for me. I felt like I gave everything that I had, honestly, and I got a tremendous amount back in terms of personal and professional satisfaction. I feel like I made a difference. I worked with some of the most incredible people that anybody could ever ask for. You being one of them, Jerry, when we worked together in Philadelphia. Just the quality, the caliber of people, the intelligence, the passion, the commitment was just absolutely incredible. I was proud to be an FBI agent. If I was 25 or 26 years old again, I'd be an FBI agent again. There's no doubt in my mind that I would do that. The opportunity and the honor of serving the public and really feeling like you've made a difference in people's lives is a sense of satisfaction that I've not felt since I left the Bureau. Even though I love what I do and I'm very, very happy, it's a real different capacity to be involved in that role. So I'm very happy to have done it, and I'm proud of the people and men and women that continue to do it day in and day out to keep our country safe.
And that's the end of the show. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Shawn. There are links to the FBI website's Cybercrime Program overview, as well as Shawn speaking on 60 Minutes and another news magazine show about cybercrime. I'm not sure if talking with Shawn made me feel better about cybersecurity or worse. But either way, I'm going to keep my money in the bank, and at this point will not be trying to stuff all underneath my mattress. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to share it with your friends and your family. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes on my website, you'll find all the social media share buttons. Now it's time for my recommendation. I gave you a little hint in the intro and during the actual show. My recommendation is very appropriately Mr. Robot. I had not watched Mr. Robot and really hadn't heard a lot about it before I did the interview with Shawn. It is on USA Network, and they describe the show as a young antisocial computer programmer who works as a cybersecurity engineer during the day, but at night he's a vigilante hacker. I learned that it was being offered by Amazon Prime, the whole first season, and so I did another one of those binge watching weekends, and I really liked the show. It has an element of Fight Club. So if you like Fight Club as much as I did, the book and the movie, I think you're going to like this show because you don't know if what Elliot, the main character, is seeing and doing is real or all in his head. You know, he sees a therapist, he's on drugs, he has these hallucinations. You know, is it real? Is it not? At the end of this whole season, are we going to find out that, you know, he's in a psychiatric hospital and he made this whole thing up? You don't know, but it keeps you on the edge of your seat. So I've had a chance to look at season 1 on Amazon Prime. I know season 2 is on right now, so you can catch that on demand, but it is an excellent show. Somebody wrote the script, and good writing is good writing. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out Mr. Robot. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again next week for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.